the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Fadl. And I'm glad you talked about our history, because I just smile when I think about it. We met at our first Mind in Life conference, and then over a decade later, we flew to Mongolia and presented to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was definitely a highlight of, I think, both our careers. So it's very special. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about the neuroscience of compassion and mindfulness meditation as I've studied it. And I'll tell you about my journey from studying the brain while people are meditating, using average group brain approaches, and then transitioning to what I call unique brain prints or individualized brain patterns, because through my training, what I found is that different people respond differently to different types of meditations. Everyone's at different stages in their life. People are working with different life phases and different symptoms that may arise. And so through my clinical training and my research training and my personal practice, I find my own experience finally told me, you know what, things are more different than they are the same. And so how can we move our approaches forwards to actually fit each person's diversity? And can we move away from averages and yet still benefit from the information averages tell us? So I'm always working through this tension between the really important information group averages tell us, and then also what's going on within each individual, which averages may or may not fit. So meditation exercises, as you may know, are ancient Buddhist practices that are increasingly used in the general public to cultivate health. And it's been such an interesting cross-cultural exchange and dialogue to be a part of. In 2017, around 14% of US adults reported practicing meditation for their health, and that's about 35 million people. And it's only grown since then. I think the interest just keeps getting higher and higher. And so over the decades, people have researched meditation to see if it could be adapted to treat mental and physical health conditions, including stress, depression, anxiety, pain, cancer, and many other conditions. Overall, we see moderate improvements, and this is because meditation is not a cure-all. It can help some people in some ways, and different people respond in different ways. And I certainly saw this in my clinical practice as a clinical psychologist. Some people were really drawn to it, and it really clicked, and we were able to adapt practices for them. Other people, I would describe a number of different treatment modalities, and they would choose something else, and that's totally fine. So as a scientist, I would like to understand these practices because I really care about figuring out optimal health behaviors and practices for each person. And so there's a measurement challenge where practices happen often internally, and we're trying to measure often external change. And so we really need good measures and good conceptualization at each level to be able to map out this transformational process that goes from internal practice to external changes in our lives. And so for the practices themselves, we're often training the quality of mindfulness, which includes being intentional, present-centered, focused or open, often to bodily sensations, being non-judgmental and compassionate. And so you can see it's already quite complicated, right? These are many different qualities of attention. And there are also different kinds of practices. You can practice while sitting, while moving, doing yoga and walking, doing the body scan, practicing compassion, which is often more visually based and phrase or word based. And so those each have challenges in measuring as well. And then we think by practicing these internal qualities, they'll start to affect our psychological processes even when we're not meditating. So aspects of attention, our thoughts and feelings, emotion regulation, our social connection. And by changing these psychological processes, we think we can start to change what I call micro behaviors, kind of these everyday behaviors we do to cultivate our psychological and physical health. So things like self-awareness, self-care exercises, eating habits, exercising, and social interactions. And over time, this contributes to our overall health outcomes of mental and physical health. So symptoms, and then on the opposite end, wellness as well, engagement and purpose in life and relationship quality. So I've given you the whole map here. It's quite complicated. As one scientist, I can only kind of chip away at a few things at a time. We need accurate measurement at each step, both subjective measures where people report on what's going on for them, and then objective measures where we use third party, more objective things that convert things into numbers that we have less influence over as people. And so I call meditation the ultimate black box, because when people close their eyes and start to meditate, we actually don't know what's happening moment to moment. We don't know where their attention is moment to moment. And so a lot of my work lately has been to try to crack open this black box. So as I've already mentioned, mindfulness and meditation cultivate multifaceted parts of attention, including the object of focus, meta-awareness, or being aware of what's going on in one's mind, being present-centered, and also emotional components such as being non-judgmental and compassionate. And there's a really great review article by Antoine Lutz and colleagues that kind of maps these out. And these are just a few of them. And so before I dive into the science, when I talk to a more general audience, I like to break qualities of attention down into more simple concepts, so that anyone, even if you have very little experience in meditating, can take something away from the talk before I dive into all the jargon and the language and the mental states. So I like to describe meditation as changing our internal attention to eventually change our outer world. And there are two main qualities of attention I think we're cultivating. One is to just slow down our processes, to start observing what's going on, especially within our bodies, to start identifying our experiences, which contributes to self-knowledge. And this is because we're often operating from what we call automatic pilot, or working on habits, and it's a quick way for our brains to just do what we need to do every day. However, some of our habits don't help us, right? Like for me, I always want to eat every delicious pastry ever. And if I operate on that habit over time, that'll be bad for my health. So breath and body-based meditations really help in cultivating the quality of slowing down. And then the second quality is to bring kindness to our experiences. It allows all of our experiences to exist, because we tend to encounter problems when we resist certain experiences, or we don't want something to happen, so we push it away, and it actually causes a lot of psychic tension. By bringing kindness, we can honor and integrate all of ourselves, even parts we're not as proud of or things we're concerned about, and it also leads to creative solutions. Loving kindness and compassion meditation really helps cultivate that quality. And by building these two qualities over time, we have the mental space to choose a better way of being with ourselves, treating other people as well, and choosing better behaviors. And this can lead to help us changing negative cycles and then building healthy habits. So the first part of my talk will be describing how I studied compassion meditation using brain data with what we call standard univariate analyses, a fancy way of saying of averaging brains together and finding what changes on average. And then, like I said, through my personal experiences practicing, through my clinical experiences teaching clients, and also through my research, I saw that really diversity is more the rule. People are different, and can we be flexible to everyone's unique minds? And with those experiences, I decided to study breath-focused meditation using multivariate or individualized machine learning techniques. So I'll describe that. Okay, so loving kindness and compassion meditation. Compassion is the feeling that arises when witnessing another's suffering and motivates a desire to help. And this definition has been really useful to help operationalize and ground how we study compassion. From my clinical psychology lens, relationships are extremely important for health. When we talk about things like depression and anxiety, we often think about people and their individual thoughts and feelings. However, individuals exist within relationships and societies. And so there's almost no client I ever talked to where we did not discuss their relationships, how they were going, how they were communicating, the quality of relationships. And we know from science that people that have more numbers of relationships, especially in different areas of their life, such as family and friends and work, and also community or religious affiliations, they tend to have better health outcomes. And it's not just how many relationships you have. Like, it's not if you have 1,000 friends on Facebook, right? The quality of relationships really matters. So people who have more positive relationships have more healthy outcomes. And on the flip side, people who have more negative relationships, people who are victims of abuse and bullying, will have worse mental and physical health outcomes. It even affects our immune system, how quickly we recover from colds, and mortality. It affects years of our lives. And so, from a public health perspective, relationships are as important for health as smoking less and drinking less. It has around the same effect sizes, and you can look at Holt-Lundstadt's work to see more of that. So I think most of us know that, drinking less and smoking less is better for our health, but how many of us know that cultivating better relationships are as important for our health? So I really hope my work expresses that. And so with loving kindness and compassion meditation, I view it as a route to better relationships to both ourselves and others. Loving kindness is wishing well-being, and compassion is just the flip side of that, where it's wishing well-being when people are suffering, when we are experience suffering ourselves, and when others are suffering. Okay. And so compassion, again, is the feeling that arises in witnessing another suffering and motivates a subsequent desire to help. And so to measure that, we need a few different components. We need the situation of witnessing suffering. We need to be able to measure and observe emotions and motivations that arise, such as different feelings and the desire to help. And then we can also measure the action where prosocial behavior is more likely to occur if compassion is present. So in this meditation, we often practice with a loved one or a benefactor, someone who has helped us. And we actually envision a time that this person or being, such as my pet, Elliot, has suffered. And then we cultivate wishing them relief from suffering. You can use phrases such as, may you be free from suffering, may you joy and ease. You can pay attention to bodily sensations, especially around the heart area. And then also visualize a light extending from your heart to the other person or being's heart to help relieve suffering. So um, it uses a lot of different sensory components of our minds. And then you can also practice with the self. And so sometimes people have harsh and critical thoughts and feelings about themselves. And this leads to symptoms of anxiety and depression. So cultivating compassion for the self can be an antidote to that. And then we can also cultivate compassion for strangers. So people we don't know as well, people we may see on the street or bus drivers. And I think more and more of us are becoming aware of suffering that strangers are encountering, especially now during the pandemic, and starting to realize that we're all connected and that everyone is deserving of compassion. We can also practice with a difficult person. This is my least favorite one. So someone you have conflict with, someone you may feel rejected by. And we often ask people to start with just a slightly difficult person, not the most difficult person in your life. But imagine how things can shift and change if we can start to feel as much compassion for someone we have difficulty with as someone we feel really close to. How can that change our patterns and our ways of interacting with each other? And so I do want to say very quickly is that all of these components can be adjusted and shifted to fit each unique person, whatever resonates with your own mind. So it took me 4 years to realize that practicing these phrases actually really confused me. I would always forget them, and I would stumble over them, and the feeling in my body was the strongest sensory component that I would sense during my meditation. So it took me 4 years to say, okay, I can let these phrases go and just focus more on my body. And once I could adjust it for myself, then I felt much more comfortable adjusting it for clients. And it was very cool to see how much faster people took to the practices and how much their health improved by adjusting to how their minds work. And also having a clinician who is willing to adjust like that, I think can be very helpful and healing. So I like to say compassion meditation is strengthening the compassion muscle, starting with a lighter weight of a loved one, moving up to a higher weight of a difficult person. And so how does this impact the brain in helping others? At the Center for Healthy Minds with Richie Davidson, they had studied compassion experts, people with tens of thousands of hours of practice, and measuring their brain activity using functional MRI, which uses magnetic energy to estimate levels of oxygen of the blood in the brain. So where there's more oxygen, we think there's more brain activity. They found that expert meditators showed much greater activity in the anterior insula and also the mid insula when hearing sounds of people suffering compared to novice controls. So their brains are more responsive to people suffering, but we need more information to really know what that means because the insula is involved in almost every aspect of conscious awareness. So my question is, what about people like you and me? Does compassion meditation change our brains and how we treat others? So we recruited people from the Madison, Wisconsin community who had no meditation experience, and they practiced every day online for 2 weeks for 30 minutes a day. So I wanted to see, it's like if you're starting a new workout routine, do you see some benefits after 2 weeks? And I intentionally chose the shorter period because I wanted first to see, does this short period have any effect? And if it does, then I think it'll be very motivating for people to try. I think people get intimidated when they hear, tens of thousands of hours can produce a change, but what about just 7 hours, 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks? So our framework was that compassion meditation should increase compassion, which we will measure with brain activity. And we also think it would change prosocial behavior. And so we developed a new measure to measure prosocial behavior, which was quite a challenge. And I'll explain that soon. So we randomly assigned people to compassion training and also to an active control group of reappraisal training where people learn to reinterpret negative events in their life to feel less stressed. And this is one of the main components of cognitive behavioral therapy, which there's decades of evidence on. So we measured their brain activity both before and after, and this was a huge strength because we could measure changes directly due to compassion training, and we could calculate changes from before to after. And then we also administered the prosocial task after training. And we called this the redistribution game, and it used techniques from behavioral economics that measure social interactions using quantifiable economic exchanges. And so in this game, player A gets $10, player B gets $0, and player C, the participant, gets $5. In the first move of the game, player A shares 1 out of $10 with player B, and that's our model of an unfair interaction or a situation of suffering. Player C witnesses this interaction, and if they want to, for every dollar they spend, it would take away $2 from player A and redistribute it to player B. So that's our model of altruistic redistribution because it's costly to the participant and it positively impacts someone else. We used an anonymous online interface for this part. People signed a separate consent form, so they thought they were participating in a totally separate study. It was described in purely economic terms. We used no words like compassion or meditation. They thought it was a separate study. So our first question was, does compassion training increase altruistic redistribution? We found after just 2 weeks of practice, 30 minutes a day, the compassion group gave significantly more in the redistribution game compared to the control group, almost twice the amount of money. So we're able to change how we treat other people with just 2 weeks of practice. I think this is really exciting. And I think, it doesn't take that much to start shifting our behaviors to a more pro-social direction. For fMRI, we measured before and after training. We showed pictures of people suffering and also neutral images of people. The compassion group evoked a sense of compassion towards these people using the phrases, using the body sensations and visual imagery. The reappraisal group reinterpreted the meaning of the pictures to feel less negative. So they might say, oh, this woman's having a headache, she'll take some medicine and feel better soon. And so when I showed this work to His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2012, he called it effortful compassion, which showed he really had a good intuition for this, because these are people who didn't have any meditation experience. And so when you're learning a new skill, you have to use effort. And in cognitive neuroscience terms, we'll call that emotion regulation or cognitive control of emotional responses. And that involves the prefrontal cortex, which is one of the most evolutionarily advanced regions of the brain in humans. And so we thought that the prefrontal cortex would be involved to start shifting people's emotional responses, to learn to be more empathically concerned with the well-being of other people and also decrease their own distress. So if you get too overwhelmed yourself by someone else's suffering, that could lead to your own distress, and then you start focusing more on yourself and taking care of yourself. So part of compassion meditation is to learn to mindfully attune to sensations of suffering and to become more equanimous with it and less reactive. And so we think the prefrontal cortex will impact the amygdala, which is involved in processing arousal and distress. It should hopefully increase the insula activation involved in empathy and bodily awareness. And then also increase the nucleus accumbens, which is one of the pleasure centers in our brain and is involved in giving charitable donations and social reward, because connecting with others is rewarding for many people. And so our main data analysis was to measure brain change by taking the brain activity after training and subtract out the brain activity before training. And we use this contrast of suffering versus neutral and tried to find what was different between the groups. And so what we found is changes in the parietal cortex, which is involved in empathy or sharing representations of mental states with other people. It's a quick route for us to understand what other people are going through. And we also saw increases in the prefrontal cortex involved in emotion regulation. And the pattern was the more people increased in these regions, the more they ended up giving in the game, showing that the people who changed their brains the most due to compassion training were the ones who changed their behavior the most and ended up being most giving. We also saw that the prefrontal cortex was communicating with the nucleus accumbens, doing what I call fancy correlations. And we saw the more connectivity between these two regions was related to more giving in the redistribution game in the compassion group, but not the control group. And so this suggests that they were learning that caring for other people might be a more rewarding situation rather than a totally aversive situation because you're encountering their suffering. And so we see compassion is actually quite a complex state. It's involving both negative and positive emotional systems. And you're learning, perhaps instead of turning away or being aversive or being overwhelmed by someone's suffering, to turn towards it with a sense of caring. And so we also wondered whether compassion could become more embodied, looking at visual attention. So embodied in terms of our eye behavior and movements. So when you practice internally, you practice looking in your mind's eye at someone's suffering. Does that actually translate into external behavior of our actual eyes looking at actual suffering in other people? And work by Ganis et al. Show that visual imagery and visual perception recruit largely overlapping brain regions. So that's really cool. When we do visual imagery, that's activating almost the same regions as if you actually saw something. So it really shows the power of our minds. And so we measured in the brain scanner how much people were looking at images of suffering versus images of neutral people. And we calculated the percentage looking time at the suffering versus the more neutral parts of images and created a percentage score. And what we saw is that the people that were able to look more at suffering were actually the people with the least amygdala activity in the brain. So even they're able to visually engage more with suffering, yet remain calm in terms of the areas of the brain that process negative emotions and arousal and trigger the fight or flight response. And so this really suggests that people are able to cultivate a more balanced response in the face of suffering. So imagine if we could train many more people in this mental state, especially healthcare workers, teachers, people that encounter suffering in their daily lives. So this meditation is freely available to download. Over 30,000 people around the world have downloaded it in the past 7 years, which makes me really happy thinking about these seeds of compassion growing. And it's at the Center for Healthy Minds website. People have adapted it for their clients, people with body image issues and eating issues. Someone emailed me and told me they were training people to be less biased towards refugees. So there's so many ways to extend and adapt this. All right. So in summary, just 7 hours is enough to change social behavior and how the brain processes suffering. And we see changes in regions involved in empathy and understanding the suffering of others, executive control and emotion regulation, social reward and charitable giving, as well as decreased distress and arousal. And I want to highlight the study by Olga Klemecki and Tanya Singer because it really makes this important distinction between empathy and compassion. I think in the general public, these terms are often used interchangeably, but they are able to scientifically distinguish these two concepts by defining empathy as feeling with someone's pain. So if someone else is feeling pain, then you kind of match their state of also feeling pain. And so when they train people to do that, that naturally increased negative emotions that they reported. And then 4 weeks after that, they learned compassion training, which cultivates more the feeling of caring and concern towards someone's suffering, which increase positive affect and reward neural systems. And so you can think of it as empathy is matching someone's negative emotions, whereas compassion is meeting someone's suffering with caring and concern, which activates the positive neural systems. And so this distinction is really important, especially in terms of issues of burnout and feeling overwhelmed that I think a lot of people are going through right now. All right, so taking a short breather, that was all my graduate work at the Center for Healthy Minds. I was learning clinical work at the same time. I was developing my own personal practice. And honestly, when I averaged all the brains together from the compassion study, I didn't see much change. It was only when I correlated it with the changes in behavior that I was starting to see which regions were involved. And so that really puzzled me because I knew compassion was having more of a behavioral impact on people. So I was just confused, honestly. And so I sat with this for a long time. And I luckily met colleagues who were using more individualized approaches to studying the brain. I had started using a more individualized approach to teaching meditation, for adapting it for my own practice. And so I really sat with this for at least a year or two and tried to figure out a new way of studying meditation that seemed to fit this diversity I was seeing all around me. And so I applied these individualized approaches to focused attention to the breath and body, which is really foundational practices for meditation. And we focus on our bodies because it cultivates interoception or awareness and understanding of our own bodily signals, which are there to help us in terms of our homeostasis, in terms of our physical needs. Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Am I tired? Our emotional needs. Am I happy? Am I sad? Am I angry? And our social needs. Who am I spending time with? Who do I feel connected to? And so one of my main messages is the signals from our bodies are really trying to help us. And it's on us to learn how to tune and read our own instrument, right? Or tune and play our own instrument. And so these signals are really aimed to telling us what we may need in our lives and our environments. And if we learn to read them and then act on them by listening to them, then this will really help our health. So my goal is never to just get rid of pain. It's to understand what is it telling me, and are there any changes I can make in my life to address the pain that's happening. So our bodies give us signals about the state of both our internal and external environment. It's very quickly interpreted by our brains. If we have emotional reactions, they're sent throughout the whole body, our pupils, our heart rate, our digestive system, glucose and hormones. And so it really is a full body response. Emotions are fully embodied. There isn't this mind-body separation in actual reality of our bodies. People can become aware of the signals in their bodies. So the study by Newman and Ma had people color in brighter colors where they feel more activation in their bodies and darker colors where they feel less activation in their bodies for different emotions. So you can see each emotion has its own pattern of bodily activation or deactivation. You can especially see differences between happiness and sadness and depression. And these patterns throughout the body that were colored can actually be distinguished through machine learning. And so this really maps onto my clinical experience, where when I taught people mindfulness, it was often to go into the body, especially the main core of the body, the breath, the chest and heart area, the stomach, the face, which has a lot of emotional information, to help people read their signals. So most people are not explicitly taught how to focus on their bodies, how to read their emotions, or even how to label them. So we really have to start at square one. What does my body even feel like? And then through discussion, what emotions may these bodily feelings be representing? What are these emotions telling me? What are the skills I need to learn to act on these feelings in order to make my life more the way I want it to be? This slide is just to show that mind wandering can sometimes be a problem. They use text messaging to ask people whether they were focused or mind wandering, and then ask their mood as well. And on average, they saw the more people were focused on their daily tasks, the happier they reported being. And I want to point out that a lot of the happier tasks are social tasks like talking, conversation, and making love. And then work is like on the negative side. So that, I think that's very telling. Um, and so we have this measurement issue in meditation because mental states are very diverse and fluctuating. So if we focus on the breath, you'll find you'll often start mind wandering. I often think about food or dinner. And then you recognize you mind wander, you come back to the breath, and then you get sleepy, and then you think about public health. Oh my God, what's happening? And so many things are happening during meditation. It's not just one state. And so more and more, it doesn't make as much sense to me to average it all together, which is what most people do in the field, because there are actually many mental states going on. You can take averages of the averages, and it shows really interesting results. We see for focused attention on the breath, we see increases in the insula, which is involved in body awareness, because breath is part of the body. And then we see decreases in areas of the default mode network, such as the posterior cingulate cortex. And those regions are involved in mind wandering, or what we call self-referential processing, thinking about our lives. And so this really clued us into the different networks involved. However, the averages have a problem because in reality, our brains all look very different. Here's a meditator and a matched control. And we average it to a standard brain. And then we get new brains that look like the standard brain. And then we average the brain activity together to get those kind of blobs you see. But it operates under this, what I believe is a false assumption that people's minds and brains work the same. We also learned from other people's work, Wendy Hasenkamp's study, that different networks are activated during different time periods during meditation. So she had people press a button when they noticed mind wandering, and that activated the insula involved in conscious awareness. And then analyzing the different time periods, both before and after this button press, you see different networks involved, such as the default network for mind wandering, and then attention to the breath, both before and after the button press of mind wandering. And so we see that with meditation, it involves different networks at different points in time. Can we map this out in even greater detail? And so this is what I did with the embody task, which treats brain activity as unique, like fingerprints. So using the same pattern recognition technology to recognize faces and fingerprints can also be applied to the brain to recognize unique brain prints or brain patterns associated with different mental states. And this approach has been around for almost 20 years. It's called multivoxel pattern analysis, which is machine learning or pattern recognition applied to functional MRI data. It was developed by Jim Haxby and colleagues. And there's many, many studies in cognitive neuroscience already using this. And so I'm just applying it to study meditation. And I call this the embodied task, which represents evaluating multivariate maps of body awareness. So we could tell whether people were paying attention to their bodies or not during meditation. And again, just to show, there are many, many studies using MBPA with fMRI data. It was started with object recognition, visual information is applied to working memory and long-term memory with my colleague, Jared Lewis Peacock. Also distinguishes social versus physical pain. It's very, very cool. I suggest everyone to learn more about it. Okay, so the first version of the embodied task, we were mainly measuring the object of attention. So were people on their breath? Were they mind wandering? Were they engaging in self-referential processing? You can already see there are so many things we're not measuring, but this was our first take at it. All right, so we can apply pattern recognition to recognize when people are engaging in interoception on the breath or mind wandering, and then apply it to meditation to actually read the mind during meditation. So the way we did that is we included another set of tasks during our fMRI task, where we actually had to train the classifiers to learn what these different internal mental states look like. We call this the internal attention task. There are 6 blocks. We have people meditate in the middle of those 6 blocks. Once the computer can learn what each person's brain patterns look like, they can then be applied to the meditation period, and we can estimate or decode what they're focusing on moment by moment. Once we have that data, we can then estimate what percentage of the time were they on their breath, how many times were they on their breath, how long were they on their breath. So I'll show you how we did that. The participants we recruited were aged 25 to 65. We had 8 experienced meditators, at least 5 years of experience practicing 90 minutes or greater a week, and at least 14 days of silent retreat practice. And then we had age and gender matched controls who didn't have as much experience. And as in many studies, the race and ethnicity for the study was a mostly white sample and also mostly male sample, which is also a pattern for meditation studies. And so we also did a study with a much more diverse sample from the East Bay Meditation Center. I'll only briefly mention that later, but feel free to ask me questions. Both of these papers are published now. So the first step of the embodied task, we had to establish that the internal attention task was working and that the classifier could indeed recognize these different brain patterns. So the way we did that was we directed people exactly where to place their attention every 16 to 50 seconds. Their eyes were completely closed and they would hear these instructions in the scanner: pay attention to your breath. You may stop now, which we thought would induce mind wandering. Think about the past week, think about the next week, think about right now in the brain scanner. That should induce self-referential processing about their lives. And then we had 2 control conditions of paying attention to the feet, which helped clarify location in the body of the breath versus the feet, and then pay attention to the sound. So the brain scanner is really loud, and so now we could model out the brain pattern associated with those loud sounds. So our first main question was, can MBPA actually differentiate these 5 internal intention states? For 5 different conditions, chance level is 20%. And what you can see is that the classifier could recognize each mental state well above chance. Over twice the level of chance is 40% to 50% for every single mental state in the study, especially breath, mind wandering, and self-referential processing, which are really common mental states during meditation. So this is really encouraging. We saw it worked in all 8 meditators and 6 out of 8 controls. And so it worked for most people. This is encouraging because many clinical studies of meditation are on novices, and I wanted to make sure that the task can be applied to novices as well. So this figure highlights the diversity of neural patterns. And so we computed what's called importance maps, and these identify voxels that maximally differentiate the brain patterns between breath, mind wandering, and self-referential processing. These voxels contribute to accurate classification. We thresholded it at 2 standard deviations. So these are the most important voxels to distinguish the 3 different mental states. You can see for meditator 1, the brain patterns are quite different for breath, mind wandering, and self-referential processing. We already saw that from previous work, but we reaffirmed that. And then meditator 2, same thing, the brain patterns different for breath, mind wandering, and self-referential processing. And then if you look across people, you can see their brain patterns are quite different, right? Same for the 2 control participants. So this really highlights that each person's brain activity that can identify these different mental states are quite diverse. And this approach highlights and capitalizes on the diversity rather than hinders it by averaging. So this is the real power of the embodied task. Once we learn these brain patterns, we can use them to decode or estimate mental states during meditation, because again, people close their eyes and we don't know what they're focusing on second by second. So with the machine learning data, it takes every brain picture during the meditation period and asks, does this look more like the breath pattern, the mind wandering pattern, or the self-referential processing pattern? And then it makes an objective decision based on each person's unique brain activity. And so we get these really cool figures where, based on meditator 1's unique brain activity, we can estimate when they're on their breath, start to mind wander, start to think about their lives. Oh my God, the election, right? Come back to the breath, mind wander, self-referential processing. Oh my God, what am I eating for dinner? Back to the breath, etc. And so now we have data that looks closer to what we already know experientially happens during meditation, right? Our attention fluctuates, and this approach can map out that fluctuation. For meditator 2, we can see a different pattern of fluctuation for that person based on their unique brain prints, because each person has their own unique experience. No 2 meditation sessions are alike between different people and also within each person, right? Every time we sit down, there's a different set of fluctuations. And same for the control participants. We can see their unique mental states during meditation. Everyone has a different pattern. And then we can compute what we call breath events, mind wandering events, self-referential processing events. Each little diamond here is a data point, and we can quantify the percentage time in each mental state, how many times were they in each mental state, how long were they in each mental state, and also what is the variability. And then based on that data, we can get these individualized attention profiles during meditation. And you can see for some people, they can pay attention longer to the breath compared to mind wandering or self-referential processing, whereas other people, it's more mixed. So for this person, they actually spent more time in self-referential processing than focusing on the breath. And we all know that happens during meditation, right? Sometimes our sessions are more engaged, our minds are just fluctuating in different areas, and there's no harm, no shame in that. It's just we're in a different place every time we meditate. All right. And then we can start to look at these data at the group level. This is a very low N, and it's 14 people. And so we take this with a grain of salt. However, it's showing like you can get individual level metrics based on each person's unique brain data. And then you can average these metrics at the group level. And we need way more data to actually know what's going on. But this first look, we can see people are focusing longer on the breath compared to mind wandering and self-referential processing on average. And that's encouraging because the main goal of this meditation was to focus on the breath. The number of times in each mental state was about the same. However, when they were on the breath, they tended to stay there longer, which contributed to this longer overall time on the breath. The variability was also greater for breath because people were able to focus longer. So we had, more variability in the durations. And so overall, this pattern suggests that people are engaging more with the breath. We need to study this in a much larger sample. We need to compare this to other data sets, like when people are in resting state, we should see much more mind wandering versus breath, right? And then we can also measure people pre-post meditation training. I really pursued this approach very, very single-mindedly because this honors neural diversity. I'm like, this approach can fit everyone, right? As long as you can pay attention to internal mental states, anyone can do this task. We no longer have to exclude left-handers because their brains are different. We don't even have to exclude people who are anxious and depressed because they're different. People come to meditation because they're anxious, depressed, have pain. So why do we exclude these people in brain studies, right? And so I really wanted to come up with a framework and methods that fit as many people as possible so that our work can benefit as many people as possible. So this paper that's now accepted in Frontiers in Psychology highlights an approach I call intersectional neuroscience, which details how we can do research as an embodied compassionate practice by including many diverse groups, people who are typically marginalized in dominant society, including the scientific community. So people of color, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, people with lower income. And all we need to do is talk to them and listen to them and change our studies to fit them better, and more people will participate. In this first study with 15 people, we collaborated with the East Bay Meditation Center that has a beautiful multicultural community to center meditation practice for minority groups. And we were able to recruit 80% racial and ethnic minorities and 53% LGBTQ people. So we changed a lot of our methods, we changed a lot of our language and our materials, and all of that is available in the paper. And we also replicated that the embody approach works with them. So the individualized approach works with more people, it works with diverse people. We included more people that had psychiatric conditions and may be taking medication. We included left-handers. And so it can all work for them. And so I think we should use methods that accommodate as many people as possible so that our results can have more impact. All right, and I was able to present this to His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Mongolia with Dr. Zaidan, who took this picture. And he was really interested in the East Bay Meditation Center multicultural community. It is the most multicultural organization I've ever encountered. They have a lot of materials online now through Zoom, especially during COVID. So please check out their website at eastbaymeditation.org. All right, and in conclusion, the Embody study is the first to be able to read the mind during meditation. And with more research, we should have much more power in understanding how meditation improves health and well-being that's uniquely tailored to people and certain populations. All right, both these papers are available. The first Embody papers in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, it goes really into the nitty-gritty in the machine learning and all the technical components. And then this paper in Frontiers in Psychology explains how we adapted it to a diverse set of meditators and how to build in compassionate processes into the research process using community engagement, and how the individualized approach is then much more inclusive of people's diverse brains and identities. All right. Okay. And I want to thank all of my collaborators. This is done with the UCSF Osher Center, collaborators at UW-Madison, the East Bay Meditation Center, and the UCSF Neuroscape Center. So thank you very much.
Excellent talk, Helen. That was awesome. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions, but or maybe one or two, but I'll go ahead and punt to our audience. If you have questions, go ahead, Lorenzo. Good to see you, mate.
Hey, hello, Helen. Thanks a lot for this very interesting talk. I'm a postdoc at UCSF at the Memory Center. I think we've met in the past. I had one question that intrigued me a lot about the data you showed is the first data would suggest that you have maybe specific centers, brain centers that are more involved in for example, supporting and compassion meditation and this behavior in the long term. And the second data would show that maybe these distributed networks are way more diverse from person. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like, I was wondering whether you'd like to elaborate a little bit on whether you think that we have a compassionate network or circuit in the brain that is similar across participants or persons, although with some variation, or where you think that it can kind of contain very different distributed brain regions.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great question. This is something I continually chew over, and I really just I want to talk to more cognitive neuroscientists that use MBPA all the time, because I had my own essential crisis with fMRI data, because in my compassion data set, if I average all the activity together, I actually see nothing. Like nothing on average changes with compassion meditation at just 2 weeks. And I think that's the issue. It was only 2 weeks. It's only when I started to use the redistribution game as a covariate, a behavioral covariate of interest, that I started to see the regions come out. So when I think if the expertise level is very different, it'll be much easier to see these differences in average brain activity. However, I am more aligned to studying clinical populations, people with less experience, because I want to know how to help, people just going about their everyday lives. And so I think the individualized approaches are better ways to capture, what does your brain look like when you're focused on your breath or your body, or what does pain look like when you're experiencing pain. um, Torweger's group has used MBPA to differentiate brain patterns with empathic concern versus empathic distress. However, they still use a group average approach, so they find like the group average MBPA brain patterns, which is also valid as well. Um, but the real power of MBPA is that we can then use that data to decode what's happening in a separate data set. So once we find people's brain patterns for empathic concern versus empathic distress, no matter what they look like, we can use a group approach, we can use an individual approach. Then once the computer learns that, we can then decode what's happening during meditation. We can decode what's happening when they're viewing videos of people in pain. And so it's really the decoding part that gives us much more measurement power, and that can give us really interesting metrics we didn't have before. So if we had the brain pattern for empathic concern versus distress, and then we quantify that during watching a video, then we can calculate the percentage time more engaging the concern aspect versus the distress aspect, right? And so it's I think if people become less attached to what these brain patterns look like, and that they have to be activated in most people to be counted as real, then we can start just seeing what's happening in each individual, and learning metrics derived from the brain data, but not essentially the brain pattern as the most important outcome. So with standard univariate approaches, the main dependent measure of outcome is the brain, right? And then we try to interpret what the brain's doing anyway, right? Oh, we see the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is involved in social reward. It's also involved in Schadenfreude. So other studies show if you watch someone in pain, your nucleus accumbens lights up. It's because it can also be interpreted as Schadenfreude because you're enjoying watching them in pain, right? And so how do we differentiate Schadenfreude from being concerned? And I think MVPA is the direction to go. We can empirically map out, what does Schadenfreude look like in this person? What does empathic concern look like in this person? And then empirically decode what pattern is more activated when they're watching someone's pain. Does this make sense? So the outcome of interest is the mental state, and the metrics we get about the mental states, and not the brain, and then having humans interpret what the brain means. That we can collect enough data where we can empirically um, interpret what the brain is doing versus making assumptions about what the biology means. Does this make sense?
But why can't you just regress out behavioral reports onto the brain and then make those deductions? Because I don't know, I would say that, in more of a traditional cognitive neuroscience training, we're taught never just to interpret blobs, although people do that. It's always as it relates to individual variability and subjective reports, let's say, and sadism, as you put it, in the nucleus accumbens versus, pain ratings, subjective reports of stress, and so on. So how does MVPA, I mean, couldn't you do an MVPA that's mapping on to individual variability of subjective reports, or just do the whole brain analysis and then regress out individual variability based on subjective reports?
Yeah, you can definitely map out MBPA with subjective reports, and that's what Tori Wager's group did with empathic concern and distress. It was, I think, one of those dial studies. What I would encourage them to do
from the
is
whole
make it,
brain, yeah, from the whole brain, averaged brain approach. How does regressing individual responses to, let's say, stress, and then seeing, more stress is associated with greater activation here, less stress is associated with lower activity, whatever. How is that not getting at the individual's uniqueness?
Yeah, I would say those kinds of models kind of fit on average, right? But there might be some participants where that brain region that you found on average isn't actually the one for that particular person that's holding the most information regarding their stress. And so there's this paper from Brad Postel's group, Journal of Neuroscience 2009, I believe, with Eva Farados as the first author, that kind of just blew open all of my assumptions about this. So they did some kind of working memory experiment, and the classical understanding with working memory is that it's represented in the prefrontal cortex, right? But they did an individual fMRI with each person and saw that there was more activation in each individual person in kind of the posterior regions, somatic regions. And so, but when they did the group average, they did also find the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And then they used TMS to simulate the group average region versus the individual region. And they only impacted memory performance when they stimulated the individual region, right? Because that's what was most important for that person. So I'm also thinking about this in terms of clinical applications, where we struggle, where in science we learn things from collecting lots of data and from averages, but then when you're a clinician in the room with someone, you have to work with that specific person where the average may or may not fit them. And so when you're working with specific people, you want to get as much detailed information about that person. And so this can also be applied with neuroscience, like what regions are important for this person, and how do we stimulate those regions either through TMS or through behavioral therapies, because psychotherapy, behavioral therapy, all of that is stimulating the brain just through a different route, right?
Yes. So yeah, thank you, Helen. I want to be cognizant of time, and I want to get GOT's question, if that's okay with you, Helen.
Sure.
Thank you. Does the MVPA pattern for an individual replicate if the participant performs multiple sessions?
It's replicating within one session, which is over 2 hours. And so it's finding the pattern that we're measuring over 2 hours. We haven't brought in people a second time. We hope to do that once the pandemic is over. Some of our experienced meditators are willing to come back. That's a really great question. I'm really curious to see. I think some will replicate and some might change, right? Because I really wonder about, through time, when you practice, you can start to experience your own internal landscape at a higher degree of granularity, which I've definitely seen in my own practice. And I think other people, you start to feel things that you may not have paid attention to before. You might start to interpret them in a different way. So I'm really curious how this deeper richness that might emerge with practice, how that's represented in the brain. I'd love to know.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to sneak in one last yes or no question because I'm curious. Did you regress out white matter when they were practicing meditation? I don't remember from the paper. I'm sorry?
What would that contribute to?
It would probably get rid of all those breathing related deactivations.
Breathing related deactivation. So to us, it doesn't really matter. We just care about brain signals that contribute to differences in the different conditions. And so it doesn't really matter. It's actually good if respiration is different between the different conditions, and that's just another form of information that can help us differentiate. We did regress out the respiration waveform for the people where we had that data, and it didn't impact classifier accuracy at all. So
right, you don't want to do that because the respiration piece is the good stuff. But what happens when you lower your breathing rate is white matter and gray matter activation both go down, but gray matter goes down goes down faster than white matter. So you'll actually get more, the statistical playing field is going into white matter type of artifacts that you could regress out. We get similar activation we get the whole brain deactivates when people practice mindfulness until we use a ComCore approach to get rid of any of those artifacts. And then we get a clear signal where we see S1 to nose, or if they're focusing on a body, we'll see an S1 to that body part and so on. I don't want to belabor it because it's every lab does it differently. I was just kind of curious from my own knowledge base.
Yeah, I think we had suggestions like that, but we had our accuracy was so high at 40% without having to do extra signal processing that I would have to have a better understanding of how that particular procedure would change classifier accuracy. Because again, the way we're using the data is different. So we have to rethink, does this help our particular pipeline processing, or is it to get the most accurate picture of the brain, which is not necessarily my approach. We want to know when people are on their breath or not, and we had enough data to estimate it.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Wonderful talk. Great attendance too. So just want to thank Helen for taking this time to present her exciting research to us.
Thank you so much.
Joseph is saying that, yeah, so it's in the notes. So anyway, thank you so much, Helen, for joining us and presenting your exciting work. And next week, I believe it's the 10th, I have to triple check, is Norman Farb's talk, which will be exciting, who's a consistent collaborator with Helen and a buddy of ours as well. So thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend and stay tuned for the next announcements for the next talk and so on. So.